Hello and welcome to today's talk. My name is Patrick Dahlin and I'm a biochemist, among other things. And today we're going to talk about exercise biochemistry. What is happening on a biochemical level within the cell when you exercise? And how does the cell adapt to exercise? And what is the difference between aerobic, anaerobic, zone 2 training, zone 3, interval training, threshold training? What are the molecular differences? What is happening within the cell and how is the cell adapting to various type of training? Because adaptation is different depending on what type of training you do. And to my help here, I've been just going into Wikipedia and searching cellular respiration, glycolysis and Cori cycle. So those are the pictures we show here. They're on Wikipedia. Of course, Wikipedia doesn't explain the exercise physiology or anything I will talk about here today. Just explain the basics, so to say. So we will start with the cell, just for orientation. Because what we're going to talk about today happens in two places in the cell. We're going to talk about the anaerobic energy production, which happens in the glycolysis. And that takes place in the cytosol, in the cytoplasma here. This is like a big ocean where a lot of chemical reactions take place. Then we'll talk about the aerobic part of energy production, and that takes place in the mitochondria, these green things here and here. And it's different to be aware of that those take place in different parts of the cell, because that is important for the adaptation of the cell, and also which system works fast and which system needs more time when they are producing energy. So from there we go into the actual chemical taking place, and as you can see here we have something called the glycolysis, and here we have the mitochondria, and inside here we have the Krebs cycle. And now there's a lot of chemistry here. You don't have to remember or memorize all these steps unless you go to biochemical school, of course, then it comes on the test. But you need to know that we start with glucose, and then there's 10 steps in the glycolysis, and we end up with pyruvate. That can be important to remember. Also that we have a net production of 2 ATP. ATP is the energy currency of the cell, the currency that works everywhere, the global currency. So anytime you move a muscle, move a body, or even think it's hot, ATP is used, consumed to be able to do those things. Then there's various type of molecules that carries energy to produce ATP, and we'll come to them also soon. And this part takes place without any oxygen is needed. Then if we look what happens after the glycolysis, the anaerobic part, we have pyruvate picked up by coenzyme A, and it takes the acetyl part here and brings that into the Krebs cycle, and then it will release an acetyl part and go into the Krebs cycle and speed things up there. And here things kind of spin around, and for every round it goes, some more pyruvate is transformed to acetyl group, and the acetyl coenzyme A takes it into there and releases it. The key thing here is that here a lot more ATP is produced, and it's transferred through these type of molecules. Maybe you've heard about these NAD+. There's a lot of fuss about NAD and supplements in anti-aging community, and NAD+ is transformed to NADH and goes to the mitochondria in the membrane, where a number of chemical reactions take place to produce ATP, and this is a zoom in. We're not going to go through all of these steps. I don't think it's necessary for this conversation. But you also have FAD, FADH2 and NAD. We also have something called NADPH. So all of those molecules are the aerobic carriers of energy or electrons, and they release these things in the mitochondria in the membrane, and here loads of ATP are produced, actually 36 ATP from each glucose, compared to only 2 net in the glycolysis. But what is the difference here? So if you do something casually in zone 1 or zone 2, these systems run in the same speed. So the glycolysis over here runs in one speed, goes into here, does the Krebs cycle in the same speed as the glycolysis. So one molecule turn around, one molecule turn around, one molecule turn around, and it goes in a steady state. That is why we also call it steady state training sometimes. But if you decide to increase the intensity, if you're running, you want to run faster, what will happen then is that the glycolysis, the anaerobic part, can go much faster than the Krebs cycle. So the body has a solution to still give you ATP, so you can increase the intensity. But this comes to a cost. You have to pay interest on this increased intensity. Because what happens here is that you will build up pyruvate. Because even though you're forming maybe 2 or 3 pyruvate and just one of them goes in here, and the faster the glycolysis goes, the more pyruvate you form, and you just use a part of that, a fraction of that, to shuffle it into the Krebs cycle and produce ATP aerobically. And this very soon becomes an issue, because the way most chemical reactions work is that if you have a build-up of something, it will start to go backwards. It's like if you have a river that floods down and then the lake below just fills up, and then it will start to go backwards. You can actually regard all chemical reactions as a flood or river, and the energy potential decides which direction they go. If you lift something up, it goes in this direction. If it's switched over like this, it will go in the other direction. It works exactly the same here. So if you build up pyruvate, things will start to go backwards. And this is something the body sometimes uses on purpose, in particular in the liver. If you don't eat any carbohydrate, it will take pyruvate and run the glycolysis backwards to produce glucose. This is called glucogenesis. But anyway, since the body now is in need of ATP, it cannot let this happen. It can't let pyruvate go backwards. So you need to remove pyruvate somewhere to get rid of it, so you can keep running the glycolysis in a high speed. And the way it does that is that some pyruvate goes in here to the aerobic cycle, but too much is produced, too fast. So the other part will take another direction out here, and that is why I've done this arrow. Just it can keep this going for a while, because this is like going to the bank and borrow to pay your bills, and then you borrow to pay the other loans you borrowed. You will very soon have to pay back with the interest rate. So what happens with pyruvate here? Well, for us humans, we are forming lactate. From glucose to pyruvate, these were the important steps I just told you. We form lactate. Lactate then can either be oxidized within the cell, but the cell is so busy, so it will not be able to oxidize much. It will either go to a neighboring cell or out in the bloodstream with the most go to the liver, and then lactate is going to glucogenesis to pyruvate and to form new glucose. Also, muscles can use lactate as it is, just burn it aerobically, and the heart and even the brain. But usually most of it, depends kind of what training you do, but often most of it goes to the liver to be resynthesized to glucose. But you can see here we got 2 ATPs from running the glycolysis, but it costs 6 to take lactate all the way back to glucose. And this is the interest rate I talked about. It's quite high interest rate. So this is why if you run a 100-meter dash, you do that very anaerobically. But when you're finished, you're winded and breathing heavily for some time because you're paying back now. You still need oxygen for that. You always need oxygen in the long term to produce energy. You can only produce energy faster short term without oxygen, just as you take a bank loan, but eventually you need to pay those money back with interest. Here you pay the ATP back, the energy back with interest. So this is our body's solution to this. Other cells does something other, like yeast, for example, it produces ethanol instead. That is why we use yeast to produce alcohol. Unfortunately or fortunately, that is not how our body works. We produce lactate. So let's go back to the full picture here, and let's zoom out a little bit so you can look at not the details but the flow of things. So let's say, once again, we go back, you are training zone 1 or zone 2 training. These things go in a steady state, which means there's not a lot of there's no interest rate being paid, and it's not only about the short-term interest rates, it's also more toxic. Toxic is a strong word here, but you can say it's toxifying for the body to produce anaerobically. It costs more in recovery time before you can train again because of the depth you put on your system. So you cannot do as much high intensity training as you can do low intensity training. So when everything goes in steady speed here, the glycolysis have an easy day because it doesn't need to go that fast. But if you do training in zone 2, and the reason it's called zone 2 is because if this one goes too much faster, we have too much pyruvate that causes lactate, and that goes out in the blood, and the blood lactate start to rise. But as long as you keep this in a steady state, so they go in approximately the same speed, there will not be too much lactate, and that is why you have this lactate threshold, usually at 2 millimolar, that you try to be below. There's 2 thresholds, but in zone 2 training. And then the Krebs cycle and the mitochondria, they work in quite high speed, not the maximum speed, but in very high speed. So they get training, even though you feel it's like an easy run or easy walk or easy bicycling road or cross-country skiing or whatever you do for your zone 2 training. So that means that you're aiming your training specifically on the aerobic system. It has to go in a relatively high speed, but the anaerobic part is just going, it's in walk in the park for the anaerobic part, because the anaerobic part can go so much faster if it needs to. So this part doesn't get an adaptation, not much at least, but this part gets adaptation. And the body will both try to speed up these things, but if you keep doing this for a longer period of time, and often you say that you need to do aerobic training, so 2 training at least 30 minutes for it to have some real effects, and 30 to 60 minutes is probably the sweet spot. When you go over 1 hour to 2 hours, you still get more adaptation, but with diminishing returns. So the sweet spot where you get most bang for the buck once it comes to zone 2 training is 30 to 60 minutes. And this is often judged by heart rate. This is another discussion. Lactate is like the gold standard, even though I don't fully agree on that always, because lactate is an indirect measure. Lactate itself does not fatigue you. If you inject lactate, you can keep going. But when lactate is produced from the cell, you get fatigued. So there are other mechanisms involved there, and not the lactate itself. But it's a very good indirect measure. But so is the oxygen consumption, and in most cases also the heart rate. So since this one going high in speed, it gets a lot of training. The body builds more enzymes to speed this process up. But if you keep doing this, it will say that this is really tiring. We go almost full speed here. Maybe we should build more mitochondria to share the burden. This system doesn't need any improvements in these speeds, but the mitochondria will need it. So this is why you sometimes they say that this zone 2 training will build this foundation, the base. It will train the mitochondria, make them bigger, and also build more mitochondria. This is a very slow adaptation. Fortunately, though, it takes a long time to build it up, but also it takes longer time for it to diminish if you have a break from training. I've seen some studies where the elite runners didn't train for 3 months, and there were maybe like 5% decline in the mitochondrial system, which is not that much after 3 months of not training at all. Other parts goes faster, both up and down. So that is why I talk about this foundation that takes time, but is very important if you are into endurance sports. Now, the other type of training you can do is threshold training. And then you speed up things a little bit, so you will build up a little bit more lactate than the body really likes. So we start to feel some resistance. And this is basically train the body to get rid of lactate faster. So we increase this somewhat, but not all out. And keep it at that level, at an elevated level, for quite some time. Because it's time and the level you work that makes the body adapt. The body doesn't know how long you bicycle, how long you run. You just know which time you do something on which intensity. So it's time and intensity that you should measure your trainings in. And also when you compare yourself, if you compare yourself with elite runners and your runner, don't compare with the mileage they run, compare to the time they use. Because if you think you should do 50% or 75% of the training of someone who is world champion, and you are maybe on the national level, you can't compete mileage because they will run longer in the same time. So then you will break yourself and actually compete or actually train longer time than they do if you do the same mileage. So look at the training times and intensities, and then you scale that to wherever level you are, if you're a beginner, intermediate, or advanced level. Time and intensity. So that was the threshold training. If we then take it to interval training, which is often used for 2-3 minutes up to 5 minutes, it seems like the optimum is around 4 minutes of training. And this is the best training to increase your VO2 max, your maximal capacity to use oxygen. And that maximum capacity you can run or do some work for about 10 to 12 minutes. Then you start to be able to slow down. You need to slow down. So therefore, by doing it 4 minutes at a time, you can, if you do 4 times 4 interval, you're doing it for 16 minutes at your maximum capacity rather than just 10 minutes. And if you do 5 interval, you're up in 20 minutes of training. And maybe around there, unless you're an elite athlete, that is probably also the sweet spot for repetition of 4 times 4 basically. Because what happens then is that this system goes to the maximum. You want to hit your VO2 max. And we'll come back to ways to kind of figure out what speed that is, what intensity that is. And that when this system goes to the maximum, this system will follow, but there will be some pyruvate overflow and some lactate building up. That is why you can't do this more than about 10 minutes. And then this system goes on maximal speed. And what happens when lactate starts to build up is that it will start to slow down this system, the aerobic system, the Krebs cycle. So that is why if we go to the next level to high intensity interval training, sprints, which often are 10 to 30 seconds, those are aimed at training this anaerobic system to go as fast as it can, and also the creatine phosphate system, which is not in the picture, but I will do a separate video about that. So then you will get more enzymes in the glycolysis to run this faster, and also to use creatine phosphate more, build up the buffer of that. But the reason, and that will also train the VO2, but not as much. And the reason for that is that if you run or do something with higher intensity than your VO2 max, because you can do things at 110 and 20% of your VO2 max, you just add the other energy anaerobically. But since then lactate is formed, so if you do this one interval, let's say you run 4 minutes or 3 minutes, the fastest you can, then you're running it over your VO2 max. And then you have a large buildup of lactate. And you remember there was a cost and interest rate to that. So, it's not like you can pay this back after the training. It just, if you do a 100-meter dash, when you're finished, you have to start to pay back. So even during these 4 minutes, you have to start pay back. And during the rest time, you're still paying back. So when you do your next run, all that lactate and other mechanisms have slowed down your Krebs cycle. So your next run will not be. Even if you run equally fast, it will just be anaerobically. This system is already slowed down. And you want to train this as close to possible at 100% of its capacity, because then it adapts the most. And if you run faster, yes, it will go 100% the first interval, but the next interval it will go slower, because now the body also needs oxygen to the liver to pay the interest rate of lactate formed, and that interest rate was quite high. So your second interval, your third interval, fourth interval, they will not go on 100% here. This system has to go slower because some oxygen, and the body knows this. That is why it slows it down, because the body knows it will have to pay back because of lactate formed. So everything is very generously designed. This cell knows that now we cannot go on 100% anymore. We need to slow down to spare some oxygen to other parts of the body, because someone is paying a debt here, which lactate essentially is an energy debt. So that is why VO2 max trainings, the intervals usually 3 or 4 minutes, maybe up to 5, should go ideally on the intensity where you're at VO2 max, but not above it. So if you're a runner, for example, and this goes for other sport, I just use running because it's maybe easier to talk about just one sport that everyone can relate to. It's the same if you do cross-country skiing or bicycling. You need to figure that speed out, and one way to do that is to know what is the fastest you can run for 12 minutes, what pace is that, and use approximately that pace. And there are sites that have all kind of help with this, threshold training and interval training, what pace it should be based on your TK pace or whatever you put in there. Maybe I should put in a link to that in this description, because there are some really nice page from Dr. Jack Daniels. He's a really good exercise physiologist. Because you don't want to go over 100% when you do this training. And also when you do VO2 max training, the body will more look at improving the efficiency of the mitochondria and the efficiency, and expand it a little bit. So this adaptation goes quite fast. You produce just more, each step here needs an enzyme. This enzyme is encoded for in our DNA. And all enzymes, everything we have in the body is encoded by in our DNA. And there's just 20 amino acids that everything is built on, so to say. So each code corresponds to one amino acid and which order to put them together, like Lego. So and that is quite easy for the body to do. It will then increase the number of enzymes that does this, and then this Krebs cycle will go faster. So this is the fast way for adaptations. While if you do it at low intensity, zone 2, you will get some of that adaptation, but also you can do it for longer duration. And when you do it for longer duration, the body will tend to start to look over the entire situation. Should we build more mitochondria? This is a longer adaptation. It takes longer time for the body to adapt. But it's very good in the long run, because if you get more mitochondria and then do a VO2 max training, you will increase the speed of this, and you also have more mitochondria. So this is why virtually all endurance athletes do so much zone 2 training. Because even though you've seen studies that interval training always give VO2 max, increase VO2 max faster than low intensity training, those studies are usually for 3 months, maybe 6 months, sometimes even shorter, 4 weeks or something. But in the long run, if you're training year after year and want to reach a high level in any endurance sport, well, then you need also more mitochondria, because that will give you an even greater aerobic capacity year after year compared to if you only do VO2 max training. But you need both, and the balance of them depends a little bit where you are, and so forth and so forth and so forth. So yeah, this is basically it. This is some repetition, the glycolysis, anaerobic, you don't need oxygen. This is within the mitochondria, aerobic. One more thing, by the way, I almost forgot here. We only look at glucose now. You also burn fat, and particularly in zone 2. And the fat also goes in here by acetyl coenzyme A, you see here coenzyme A, in here. And which means that when you burn fat, because you can't go backward, you can't do carbohydrates from fat, you can't take them out and purify from it. This is one-way direction. Many chemical reaction goes both ways, like the glycolysis, but not this particular step. So fatty acids that come in here with an even number cannot go backwards. So they are totally aerobic. So the more fat you can burn, the more aerobic oxidation you can do, and there's no chance at all that you will form any lactate. And this is also something you train the body with this too, since it now has time to also bring fat into the equation. But this also is impacted by diet. So if you do carbohydrate loading and things like that, your body will use maybe 50% carbs and 50% fat, roughly, in zone 2 training. But if you eat more fat and less carbs, maybe go even ketogenic, well then you might use like 90% fat. You can burn elite endurance athletes can burn 2 grams fat per minute when they're exercising, if they're fat adapted. If not, they will burn less. And there's a big debate here which is best, because in the old school book it said that fat could not go through the Krebs cycle as fast as carbs, but it seems that it can. It's just that we tested this on athletes that were carbohydrate adapted. They were not eating much fat, so therefore the body is good with burning carbs. So both your training and what you eat will ramp up this various system, because when you eat ketogenic you will also ramp up this system just because the way you eat, because you're only burning fat. So this system needs to be ramped up. And also ketone bodies also go into here directly in this acetyl coenzyme I step, and they cannot form lactate either or return into carbs. Sometimes the body uses some protein also, but that's not too much. It's only if you're really deprived of the other energy nutrients. But anyway, can we just work the mention that protein either goes into the glycolysis, because most amino acids can be transformed into glucose. But not all. There's some ketogenic one that only can be burned the ketogenic way. But most of them can go either the glycolytic way or the ketogenic way, depending on the needs. But generally when you exercise, this is not something the body uses only during starvation or fasting, or if you only eat protein and nothing else, then it will burn more protein. But for the most part, it's carbohydrates and fat we're using in various amount, depending on the intensity. So now I think I covered everything I plan to cover. So please, if you like this, like it, subscribe, coming up with more of these things. And also if you have a question, please put them in the comment, then I get ideas. Either will just answer your question in the comment, or I get ideas for what to do in maybe the next video, depending on what you're interested in. So thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe.